When talking about faith-based media, many skeptics, me included, can be guilty of reductively rolling our eyes and rattling off all the grifting, trash-flavoured trash, as if this rubbish is in any way an honest representation of religious art. In reality, some of the finest works of Scorsese, Kiarostami, Malick, Anderson, Wirasethakul, Schrader, and Aronofsky are directly informed by faith. Ditto a not insignificant number of my favourite albums, books, and episodes of The Simpsons.
Well, whether or not the soul is physically real, Bart, it's the symbol of everything fine inside us.
To deny the foundational impact religion has had on art, even if it's an atheistic response to it, is to ignore millennia of cultural, historical, political, and sociological significance.
The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. That's the way he is.
With that in mind, one work rules above all others as the top-earning foreign language feature in US history, and globally the highest-grossing independent and religious film ever, all the while acting as a focus of devout celebration and analytical scrutiny, as well as a lightning rod for the decades of conversation and controversy that followed. This is The Passion of the Christ. From his betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane to the final plunge of the Lance of Longinus, The Passion of the Christ subjectively details the last 12 hours in the life of Jesus. The opening shot of a night sky pans down to find the Son of God enveloped by a splendour of trees and greenery, as if to show the moonlit kingdom of heaven looming over the natural world. The spiritual and physical, forever interconnected, but divided by mortal planes. It's a phenomenal piece of visual storytelling, and stands in direct contrast to the arid dirt, sharpened steel, and burning sand that will serve as the backdrop for Jesus' final moments. This whole section immediately illustrates this film's greatest strength: its compositional, photographic detail. Cinematographer Caleb Deschanel's decision to shoot every scene slightly above the industry standard of 24 frames per second subtly instills each moment with an ethereal weight, illustrating the crawling anguish of a man who knows his journey home will be one of physical and spiritual woe. Then, when we see events unfold from the perspective of Judas, the frame rate is ramped up to the point of outright slow motion, the burden of his betrayal acting as a molasses his soul can't hope to wade through. It's a show don't tell approach that allows the medium of film to echo the interior turmoil of these particular moments. This also applies to how Deschanel and director Mel Gibson utilised tight framing, overly cluttered crowd blocking, and busy shot composition to create suffocating claustrophobia in otherwise open courtyards and forums, emphasising the crushing limitations imposed by both the braying masses and the cage of Christ's mortal frame. Special commendation should also be given to the creative choice to present all spoken dialogue throughout in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin. While that may sound like a no-brainer based on the historical and geographical parameters of 33 AD Golgotha and Jerusalem where Jesus met his earthly demise, there are very few iterations of this often told tale that even attempt to adhere to the lexicon and language of the setting.
Will you align yourselves to the will of God?
By communicating with these appropriate tongues and shunning contemporary concessions, The Passion of the Christ creates a rock-solid sense of temporal and spatial immersion that would have been shattered the second someone started sermonizing in American English. Language here is also employed as a subtextual signifier. most notably when Pontius Pilate confers with Jesus in Aramaic, only to be answered in word-perfect Latin.
Kant Mel-ephant.
Atemitipsohoktichis Adnorogasquia ali Siktiksarunt tibi deme.
Given that Latin was all but a dead tongue to the working natives of the region, this shows Jesus displaying a divine command of a language a Judaic Aramaic carpenter would likely have no access to, whilst also alluding to the underlying communication breakdowns and misinterpretations that led to his unjust incarceration and execution. All of which rests atop John Debney's elegiac impeccable score, and some key performances the film simply wouldn't function without. Jim Caviezel's titular turn demonstrates the battered but enduring resolve of a man caught between hell on earth and the promise of heaven.
Regnum meum non est hoc mundo.
Maya Morgenstern's Mary is given significantly more to do here than in any documented telling of this story, and humanises these events through the perspective of a mother meeting the unspeakable death of her child with compassion and broken-hearted strength. However, it's Hristo Shopov's take on Pontius Pilate that dominates the second act and arguably the entire feature. Torn in opposing political directions and eaten away by a conflicting sense of duty, morality, and existential trepidation, I'm astonished that more appraisals of this work don't acknowledge just how much of an achievement this portrayal is.
Si hunc non condemnabo, sciu Caiapham, seditionem initiaturum esse. Si ita condemnabo, discipuli eius initiabunt, muter libet sanguis effunditur.
Now, I imagine many of you watching this are waiting for the scathing criticisms to spill forth from my atheist lefty throat. And yeah, there's plenty of that on the way. But here's the thing. I'm not interested in thin-skinned critical drinking rage bait, and I believe art needs to be viewed holistically rather than as a list of contextually divorced pros and cons. Because it's important to understand that this technical acumen and artistic eye are the Passion of the Christ's Trojan horse, an impressive facade that unfortunately hides a cruel weapon of sacrilegious misinterpretation, bigoted aberration, and acidic authorial influence intent on preaching abject hatred over love and forgiveness. During a flashback sequence of Jesus showing off his carpentry skills, the Passion of the Christ heavily implies that the Son of God invented dining tables and chairs. Yes, it's extremely silly, but it's also my favourite moment here. Along with a few other scattered flashbacks, we get to see a warmth, sensitivity, and divine adoration broadly commensurate with the teachings of the New Testament. Unconditional love, forgiveness, and a righteous commitment to the good of all humanity. Unfortunately, the majority of this is outright inverted into a grueling tapestry of condemnation, pornographic suffering, and anger in almost every other scene. Much has been made of this film's unvarnished violence, with David Edelstein of Slate magazine famously dubbing it the Jesus Chainsaw Massacre. The idea that this is all just a holy man getting ripped apart for 2 hours and change is an exaggeration, but not outright hyperbole. Over 65 minutes of the total runtime here consists of shots of Christ being physically tormented, psychologically tortured, or slowly murdered. And with fleeting exceptions, the whole feature can be broken down into 3 types of scenes. 1. Jesus being horribly forsaken by people who immediately regret it. 2. Heated exchanges about whether to eviscerate Jesus and how best to go about doing that. And 3. The whipping, bone-breaking desecration of Jesus. I appreciate the power of explicit and shocking imagery to communicate themes and experiential perspectives, and there are moments here, such as the bearing of the cross, that actually manage that quite well. The problem is that by wallowing in these extremes for over half the runtime, any scrap of Jesus being a figure of hope, healing, and forgiveness is snuffed out and replaced with seeping wounds. I mean, if you say you're throwing a birthday party, then light the candles by launching a Stinger missile directly at little Billy, nobody's gonna come away thinking about how kind Billy was to all the other kids. They're just gonna be gawking at the blood and guts before turning their ire on the guy holding the rocket launcher. Mel Gibson has stated he intended to use violence as a visual metaphor for Christ's redemptive suffering.
That was the whole point of it. It was the mystery of suffering.
Mel, Bubby, that is not how metaphors work. Showing someone being tortured isn't a metaphor for someone being tortured. It's just someone being tortured. Do you know what the Gospels actually say happened here and how much time is dedicated to all this awfulness? Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. John 19:1. That's it. Gibson also feels fit to retcon the good book when he shows Satan teasing Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, despite not a single Christian text depicting this, so he could sneak in some homophobia. Here we have a queer-coded Satan with the shorn body of a woman and the voice of a man trying to coax an archetypical man's man with a snake that emerges from between their sinful legs. Jesus then rejects this definitely not a penis by stamping on it. Subtle. These gratuitous additions each emphasize division over unity, and show how The Passion of the Christ isn't about honouring the sacred texts and doctrines regarding the life, deeds, and death of the Son of God. This is about Mel Gibson's persecution complex.
Seriously persecuted. And as an artist, as a filmmaker, as a man, as a Christian,
and inability to internalize or extol anything beyond the barbarism he sees in the Bible. Rather than demonstrating the light or warming embrace of Christ, all this movie seems interested in is showing how much terror he could stomach. All of this is detrimental to the functionality of this as a narrative work. The 3-act structure is just a trifecta of torment, and it becomes sluggishly dull in the same way someone telling the same offensive joke 126 times in a row would quickly become impactless and interminable. We learn next to nothing about the personality or spirituality of anyone here, because the communion wafer-thin characterizations begin and end with their proximity to agony. This dilution of developmental and dimensional layers in favour of whipping afflictions also leads to The Passion of the Christ's most contentious issue: its portrayal of Judaism. In the 16th century, the Council of Trent Catechism was disseminated by the Catholic Church to rebuke any anti-Semitic rumblings attributed to the Gospel of Matthew. They did this not only to stem talk of Jewish deicide, but to remind everyone that such myopic blame actually undermines the sacrifices and death of Jesus. After all, if you were to put the crucifixion on Judaism rather than the sins of humanity as a whole, then that would mean that Jesus didn't die to absolve mankind. It would mean his death offered forgiveness to those of Judaic affiliation specifically and exclusively. This simple and even-handed explanation as to why anti-Semitism is in no way in service of Christianity or Christ doesn't jive with the man who turned Evian into Cabernet Sauvignon being flayed alive at the behest of cackling Hasidic caricatures so gaudy they make Shylock look like Gloria Steinem. Despite the many "that's not what I meant" justifications Gibson has given over the years, the Passion of the Christ's depiction of Jews is unambiguously couched in horrifying tropes and the targeted vilification of anyone who doesn't prescribe to his very peculiar brand of dogmatic revisionism.
There was a parallel counterfeit church set up to eclipse the real one.
The fact that Jesus was born of a Jewish mother, preached Jewish teachings, made disciples of Jews, and proudly worshipped in 1st century synagogues is sandblasted away here in favour of reappropriating Christ as a martyr that stands against any form of belief that deviates from traditionalist, sedevantist, ultra-conservative, fringe offshoots of Catholicism.
Just a second, Father. When did you last check your facts? By point entirely. We've had this book analysed. It reads like the ramblings of a drugged horse.
Throughout the film, Jews are painted as upper-class merchants of lip-licking masochism. Their repudiation of all sanctity beyond their tunnel vision of loathing makes them entitled and malicious as they use opulence and corruption to get their way.
الكايزر هشكوثك
Elsewhere, they're even shown to be orc-like in appearance, while their offspring are revealed to be Mac and Me-looking monstrosities who actively collaborate with Satan. Absolutely none of which is in any form of the Catholic Bible. There aren't even any scholarly sources that say Jesus was apprehended and beaten by Jewish guards, but rather Matthew 26:47 states rather ambiguously that it was a large crowd. Nor was Jesus thrown off a bridge and hung by chains while a Hasidic cabal looked on and laughed. That's pure Mel Gibson melodrama. Melodrama? King Herod, an Arabic Jew, is changed from a tyrannical leader into an infantile party boy who looks distractingly like JonTron. And as with Herod here, the largely dark-skinned populace of the time has been whitewashed until the only persons of colour are an infinitesimally small number of zoned-out extras. In one wildly insensitive scene, a Jewish leader aggressively rips at their clothes when confronted by Jesus. What is played out as a petulant temper tantrum is actually a bigoted distortion of the Judaic practice of Kriya, a solemn act of mourning wherein the bereaved rend their garments to signify their overpowering sense of grief when a loved one dies. It is not, as Gibson shows here, a childish act of annoyance. In the name of context and understanding, it's important to note that Mel Gibson has stated that he took copious influence from the stunningly racist ramblings attributed to Clemens Brentano and Anne-Catherine Emmerich, which collectively define Jews as a breed of baby-strangling, blood-harvesting witches who are born incapable of human decency.
Oh no, 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 no.
Again, this is a willfully ignorant refusal to ethically and honestly recreate the actual teachings and theology in favour of introjecting personal prejudice, and in doing so manipulating a text of salvation into one of scorn. That's because, by his admission, Gibson chose to disregard the Council of Trent Catechism I mentioned a little while back, and the 1965 Ecumenical Council of Pope Paul VI, who confirmed a little thing called the Nostra Aetate into Catholic law. First, This declaration asserts that all major world religions have a right to exist alongside Catholicism without harassment or undue admonishment. Second, it specifically does away with any notion, inferred or otherwise, by the Gospel of Matthew or the Passion that those affiliated with Judaic practices are solely responsible for or to be held continually accountable for the death of Jesus.
He says that the seeds of erosion of the church were sown with the reforms of Vatican II, and I agree with him.
So, if the protracted flaying, gay devil, and anti-Semitic inferences of the Passion have repeatedly been walked back or called outright poppycock by the Catholic Church, then it stands to reason that much of this bile must be coming from the man calling action.
The actor-director made derogatory comments about Jews and women.
Esterhaus blamed Gibson when the script bombed, branding him an anti-Semitic loon who called Jewish people oven dodgers.
Mel Gibson's pre-adulthood indoctrination by a Holocaust-denying, ultra-right-wing conspiracy theorist father, that goes to show how cycles of hate continue, and no child should be blamed for the home they're born into, and I have no doubt these adverse childhood experiences hurt Gibson more than we could ever know. But understanding the nuance when applied to the facts as they stand can condemn as well as illuminate, as is the case when, decades later, Gibson decided to personally fund his father's Holocaust-denying church when it splintered off from Vatican doctrine because he felt they'd been infiltrated by Jewish liberal disruptors.
His father is never happier than when talking about the absence of any evidence for the Holocaust, shall I put it. And Mel Gibson repeatedly says that his father has never told him a lie.
Or when, shortly after The Passion of the Christ released, Gibson went on a completely unprompted tirade against the Jews.
Expletive Jews. And to Officer Me, are you a Jew? And the Jews are responsible for all the wars in the world. Are those anti-Semitic words?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Or when he proclaimed that only those who prescribe to his specific, unaffiliated fringe school of Catholicism will get into heaven, while everyone else, including different branches of Christianity and his own wife, will be damned to hell. See, this is why cultural, textual, authorial, and historical context is so important, given how demonstrably it has bled into this work. I mean, you know when a show as edgelordy as South Park considers your warped propagandizing perspective so deeply offensive that they dedicate an entire episode to calling out your hate-mongering?
The Passion was actually done as a performance piece back in the Middle Ages to incite people against the Jews.
Odds are you're on the wrong side of righteousness.
If you want to be Christian, that's cool, but you should follow what Jesus taught instead of how he got killed. Focusing on how he got killed is what people did in the Dark Ages, and it ends up with really bad results.
We shouldn't focus our faith on the torture and execution of Christ.
Yeah, lots of people got crucified in those times. We shouldn't rely on violence to inspire faith.
Not only does Gibson attempt to supplant scripture with axe-grinding solipsism, but in doing so he robs the final film of nuance, tact, narrative cohesion, and engageable points of relatability and honesty. This leaves the final product as less provocative, more boring, and ultimately vapid because it tries so hard to achieve profundity through shock tactics and intolerance rather than ethics, honesty, or an attempt to extol the virtues the Bible actually puts forth.
Thanks a lot for joining us, Mel. Take care.
Bye-bye. Asshole.
Based on its success and continuing cachet amongst the devout and devotional, it speaks to a wide array of people on a level that I do not believe can be entirely attributed to hate and division. And I want to be explicitly clear here, if you love or like this film, I do not think that makes you anti-Semitic or in any way a bad person. If you take positivity and an affirmation of faith, morality, and decency from this telling of the crucifixion, I'm not here to belittle or deny your feelings. I'm just here to say that those feelings are yours. Don't give credit for that to this guy. That goodness, consideration, and empathy are not born of a man who uses the Bible like wrestlers use folding chairs. Mel Gibson does away with narrative structure, characterization, and any allegiance to a text he claims to hold with pious regard, so that he can instead hyperfixate on acrimony and antagonism, and co-opt a form of exploitation cinema to exploit the empathy of his audience. His personal touch is a smothering expression of his demons, rather than an ecclesiastical or cinematic gesture of artistic interpretation. And after consulting with a few people who know far more about this than I do, I can't help but think Mel Gibson would have done well to listen, forgive, and take note of Matthew chapter 23, verse 28. Outward you appear righteous unto men, but within you are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. A special thanks to our Patreon producers Jennifer C, Claire MD, Beckio, Kay Kraus, Jennifer Fetish, and Nicholas Lair-Revere, and all these amazing patrons who made this episode possible. So what are your experiences with The Passion of the Christ, and what are your favourite faith-based or religiously themed films? Let me know down in the comments, please be respectful, and if you're in a position to do so, consider having a look at our Patreon where you can get your name in the credits, access to the In-Frame-Out Film Club, and membership to our private Discord. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, this is In-Frame-Out.